It wasn't the punch itself that hurt the most. It wasn't even the mocking laughter that followed, or the smug smirk plastered on Damian's face as he leaned back in his chair. No, it was the betrayal, the gut-wrenching realization that the woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, had turned me into a joke in front of strangers. I stood there, stunned, the sting of Sophia's fist still radiating across my cheek. The room fell silent for a split second, but then it erupted into laughter, sharp, cruel, and deafening. Damian's friends, a crowd of well-dressed sycophants, clinked their glasses together, their amusement at my expense filling the lavishly decorated room. "Well, James," Damian drawled, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "looks like Sophia has more fight in her than you." The smugness in his tone cut deeper than Sophia's fist ever could. I looked at her, hoping to find some semblance of regret, some flicker of the woman I had once known. But there was nothing. She stood there, her eyes avoiding mine, her lips pressed into a tight, indifferent line. It was surreal. How had we ended up here? A few hours earlier, I had walked into this nightmare with the naive hope of salvaging my marriage. Sophia had invited me to the party, claiming she wanted to clear the air. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I wanted to believe there was still something worth saving, that the past few months of cold distance and whispered phone calls could be explained away. But the moment I arrived, I realized I was walking into a trap. The party was hosted at Damian's sprawling mansion, a place I had never been but had heard enough about to recognize. Damian was a name that had loomed over my marriage like a dark cloud, a man Sophia had insisted was just a friend, but whose presence had grown too prominent to ignore. From the moment I stepped inside, the tension was palpable. Sophia barely greeted me, offering a tight smile before disappearing into the crowd. Damian, however, made a beeline for me, his grin as wide as a predator spotting wounded prey. "James," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Glad you could make it. Sophia told me you'd be coming. Brave of you." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. I wanted to walk away, but I stayed. I stayed because I wanted answers. I stayed because I wanted to believe that my wife wouldn't humiliate me in front of her lover and his entourage. I was wrong. As the evening wore on, the insults grew bolder. Damian's friends whispered behind their champagne glasses, their glances darting toward me. Sophia's friends, Emily and Chloe, made little effort to hide their disdain, giggling and throwing me pitying looks. I tried to speak to Sophia, pulling her aside into a quiet corner. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "Why did you bring me here?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw regret in her eyes. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Because you needed to see the truth," she said simply. "The truth?" I repeated, incredulous. "What truth?" Before she could answer, Damian appeared behind her, sliding an arm around her waist as if staking his claim. "The truth, James," he said with a smirk, "is that she's moved on. Maybe you should too." The punch came moments later. I had tried to keep my composure, but when Damian made a snide comment about my career, a cheap shot about how Sophia deserved someone more ambitious, I couldn't hold back. "You think you're better than me?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You think this is going to end well for either of you?" Sophia stepped between us, her face tight with anger. "Don't make a scene, James," she hissed. "A scene?" I laughed bitterly. "You brought me here, Sophia. You wanted a scene." And then it happened. Her fist connected with my cheek, the crack of her knuckles against my skin silencing the room. For a moment, no one moved. Even Damian looked surprised. But then, as if on cue, the laughter began. I stood there, my cheek throbbing, my pride in shreds. I could have yelled. I could have retaliated. But instead, I turned and walked out. As I reached the door, I heard Damian call after me. "Come on, James. Don't be such a sore loser." I didn't respond. I didn't even look back. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap, clearing my mind and steadying my resolve. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the events of the evening replayed in my head. They thought they had one. They thought I was defeated. But they didn't know me. They didn't know what I was capable of. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I sat in the darkness of my car, parked on the quiet street outside my home. The events of the party replayed in my mind like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. Sophia's punch, Damian's smug grin, the laughter. It all burned in my chest. The humiliation clung to me like a second skin, but beneath it, something stronger was rising. Anger. Not the kind that made you lash out blindly, but the kind that simmered, calculated, and grew sharper with every passing second. Sophia had betrayed me. Damian had humiliated me. And her friends, those enablers who clinked glasses and whispered behind my back, had watched it all unfold like a spectacle for their entertainment. I wasn't going to let this slide. When I finally walked into the house, it was dark. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, but I welcomed it. I needed time to think, to plan. I wasn't a man who believed in reacting out of pure emotion. My father used to say, "A sharp mind cuts deeper than a sharp tongue." I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace. The memories of my marriage flooded my mind, every detail suddenly laced with doubt. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? Sophia hadn't always been this way. There was a time when she was my world, when we'd spend hours talking about our dreams, our future, the life we wanted to build together. Somewhere along the line, that changed. I thought it was the stress of work, the natural ebb and flow of a long relationship. But now, I saw the truth. Damian had been there, lurking in the background, whispering poison into her ear. The next morning, I called Ryan. He picked up on the second ring, his groggy voice immediately sharpening when he heard mine. "James," he said, "what's going on? You sound off." I sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I need your help, Ryan. Something happened last night. Something I can't ignore." "Talk to me," he said. I told him everything. The party, the punch, Damian's smugness, the mocking laughter. Ryan didn't interrupt, but I could hear his breathing grow heavier as I spoke. When I finished, there was a long silence before he finally said, "James, this isn't just about infidelity. This is about humiliation. They didn't just betray you. They wanted to destroy you." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Exactly. And I can't let it go." "You shouldn't," Ryan said firmly. "What's your next move?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I'm not going to sit back and let them win." Ryan suggested I contact someone he knew, a private investigator named Natalie. She specialized in uncovering the kinds of secrets that people like Damian worked hard to hide. At first, I hesitated. Hiring a PI felt like crossing a line. But then I thought about the look on Damian's face, the way Sophia had stood by his side without a shred of remorse. I didn't hesitate anymore. Meeting Natalie was like stepping into a noir film. She had an air of quiet confidence, her sharp eyes scanning me as though she already knew everything. "Ryan told me you have a problem," she said, cutting straight to the point. I nodded. "It's not just a problem. It's a betrayal. My wife, Sophia, has been having an affair with a man named Damian. But it's not just about the affair. He's been manipulating her, turning her friends against me, and humiliating me in public." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "And you want to know how deep it goes?" "I want everything," I said firmly. "I want to know who he really is, what his motives are, and what he's been doing behind the scenes. I don't just want the truth, I want the leverage." Her lips curled into a faint smile. "I can do that. But you should know, the truth isn't always pretty." "Neither is betrayal," I replied. Over the next few days, Natalie got to work. She didn't just uncover Damian's past, she dismantled it piece by piece. Damian wasn't just some charming socialite. He was a con artist with a history of preying on wealthy women and men with influence. Natalie discovered that Damian had a pattern. Infiltrate a relationship, sow doubt, and position himself as the better option. He used charm to disarm his victims and their partners, then exploited their vulnerabilities to gain financial and social leverage. Even worse, Sophia's friends, Emily and Chloe, weren't just bystanders. They were active participants in Damian's schemes, encouraging Sophia to leave me and cut me out of my own life. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. Damian hadn't just taken my wife. He'd turned my marriage, my social circle, and my sense of stability into weapons against me. When Natalie presented her findings, Ryan was there, his expression darkening with every revelation. "This guy's a parasite," Ryan said, "and he's using Sophia to get to you. He's not just after her. He's after your assets, your connections, your life." I nodded, my jaw tightening. "Then we make sure he doesn't get it." Natalie leaned forward, her voice steady. "What's the plan?" I looked at both of them, my resolve solidifying. "We fight fire with fire. If Damian thinks he can take everything from me, then I'll take everything from him first." As I left the meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. Damian had thought he could humiliate me, destroy me, but he had underestimated the one thing I had that he didn't: patience. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming what was mine. And Damian was about to learn that you don't push a man like me without consequences. I sat across from Natalie in her modest office, a space that didn't seem to fit the reputation she carried. She was sharp, methodical, and unflinchingly direct, which was exactly what I needed. I couldn't afford a mistake. Damian had already humiliated me publicly, stripped me of my dignity in front of Sophia and her toxic entourage. Now, I was determined to return the favor, but this had to be strategic. It wasn't about anger, it was about precision. Natalie spread a stack of documents across her desk, each one a piece of the puzzle she had started assembling about Damian. "Here's what I've got so far," she said, tapping the corner of one of the papers. "Damian isn't just a smooth-talking playboy. He's a manipulator. He finds people with money or influence, ingratiates himself into their lives, and uses them until there's nothing left to take." I clenched my jaw as I stared at the files. There were photos of Damian with other women, smiling that same smug grin he had worn the night of the party. Bank records showed suspicious transactions, shell companies, and what appeared to be off-the-books income from shady deals. "How long has he been doing this?" I asked. "Years," Natalie replied, leaning back in her chair. "He's been careful, but no one's untouchable. From what I've found, Damian has targeted at least 3 other couples like you and Sophia. 2 marriages ended in divorce, and the third—" She paused, her expression darkening. "The third ended with the husband in financial ruin." I felt my hands tighten into fists. "And Sophia? How much of this does she know?" Natalie hesitated. "Hard to say. From what I've seen, Damian's very good at controlling the narrative. He probably made her think she was his equal in this, but I'd bet she's just another pawn." Ryan joined us a few minutes later, carrying coffee and a folder of his own. "I did some digging on the social angle," he said, sitting next to me. "Sophia's friends, Emily and Chloe, they're not just random cheerleaders in this mess. Emily has a history of encouraging this kind of behavior. She was part of one of Damian's earlier projects. Chloe, on the other hand, seems like a follower, someone who does whatever the loudest voice tells her to." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "So it's not just Damian. It's an entire network." "Exactly," Ryan said. "And that's what makes this complicated. If we go after Damian alone, the rest of them will scatter like roaches. If we want to take him down for good, we need to hit everything at once." Natalie nodded. "Agreed. But there's more." She pulled out a larger folder and slid it across the table. "This is where it gets personal." I opened the folder and felt my stomach drop. Inside were copies of texts, emails, and financial records, proof that Damian had been coaching Sophia on how to separate herself from me legally and financially. He was trying to get her to access my family trust, the one I had carefully built to protect our assets. "He's not just after your wife," Natalie said quietly. "He's after your money, your reputation, and your connections. This isn't just an affair, it's a takeover." The realization hit me like a freight train. Damian hadn't just stumbled into our lives. He had planned this. Every interaction, every whispered word to Sophia, every smirk at me, it was all calculated. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. "What do we do?" Ryan leaned forward, his voice low. "We fight back, James. But we don't just react. We take control." Natalie smiled faintly. "I've already started. I've been feeding information into Damian's network, Just small things, enough to make them doubt him. People like him thrive on trust, and once that cracks, the whole thing falls apart. I nodded, my mind racing. What about Sophia? If she's part of this, if she's helping him, we'll figure that out, Natalie interrupted. Right now, we focus on Damian. He's the ringleader. Take him out, and the rest will collapse. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the files Natalie had given me. The anger I had felt at the party was still there, but now it was tempered with something else, clarity. This wasn't just about revenge. Damian had tried to dismantle my life, and now it was my turn to dismantle his. I called Natalie the next morning. I want to set a trap, I said. Good, she replied, because he's already walking into one. She explained the plan, and as I listened, I felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Damian thought he was untouchable, that he could humiliate me and take what he wanted without consequence. But he was about to learn just how wrong he was. By the time I hung up, I was smiling. Not the forced, polite smile I had worn at that party, but a real one. Damian had tried to tear my life apart, but now I had the upper hand. The game had shifted, and this time, I was in control. The days after my meeting with Natalie and Ryan were a blur of quiet determination. Every hour was spent methodically dismantling Damian's web of lies, one thread at a time. I couldn't afford to let my emotions take over. This had to be calculated, precise. Damian had built his empire on manipulation and deceit, but he had one fatal flaw: arrogance. He thought he was untouchable, that he had played his game so well no one could catch him, that arrogance would be his undoing. Sophia, on the other hand, was a different story. She moved through the house like a ghost, her presence barely noticeable. I wasn't sure if she was avoiding me out of guilt, or because she had convinced herself she was still in the right. She hadn't mentioned the party, Damian, or her friends since that night. And honestly, I preferred it that way for now. But I couldn't ignore the nagging question in the back of my mind. How much of this had Sophia known? Was she just another pawn in Damian's game, or had she been complicit from the start? I needed answers, but first, I needed to set the stage. Ryan and I met at a quiet cafe downtown to finalize the plan. Natalie had already begun infiltrating Damian's network, spreading whispers and planting seeds of doubt. The key, she had explained, was to make Damian think his own empire was crumbling from the inside. We need to make him paranoid, she had said. People like Damian thrive on control. Take that away, and they unravel. Ryan leaned across the table, his voice low. We've got the bait ready. Now we just need to make sure he takes it. What kind of bait? I asked, sipping my coffee. A deal, Ryan said, sliding a folder across the table. Something too good for him to resist. Caleb helped us create it. It's a fake investment opportunity, tied to a fake company with fake assets. But on paper, it looks like a gold mine. I flipped through the folder, impressed by the level of detail. The financial projections, the contracts, even the email correspondence. It all looked legitimate. And he'll believe this? I asked. Ryan smirked. He'll believe it because we're feeding it to him through one of his own contacts. Natalie found someone in his circle who's ready to turn on him. For the right price, of course. I nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling over me. Damian wouldn't just fall for the trap. He'd walk right into it with a smile on his face. That evening, I returned home to find Sophia in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. You're late, she said, her tone casual but laced with something I couldn't quite place. Busy day, I replied, setting my bag down. A lot going on. She hesitated, as if debating whether to say more, then went back to her phone. I watched her for a moment, the woman I had once trusted completely. It was strange, seeing her like this, guarded, distant, almost like a stranger. Sophia, I said finally, breaking the silence. She looked up, her eyes wary. What? What's going on with you? I asked, my tone calm but firm. You've been distant, different. What's happening? Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. I don't want to talk about this right now. I nodded slowly, not wanting to push her. Fine, but we will talk about it. Soon. She didn't respond, and I left her there, feeling the distance between us growing wider. The next day, Natalie called with an update. "He's biting," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Damian?" "Who else?" she replied. "He's already started asking questions about the deal. And his contact, the one we planted, is feeding him exactly what he wants to hear. He thinks this is the opportunity of a lifetime." "Good," I said. "What's the next step?" "We let him make the first move," Natalie said. "The more effort he puts into this, the harder it'll be for him to back out. And when the rug gets pulled out from under him, he'll have no one to blame but himself." I couldn't help but smile. Damian had no idea what was coming. Over the next week, the plan unfolded perfectly. Damian became increasingly obsessed with the fake deal, pouring his energy and resources into securing it. Meanwhile, Natalie continued to spread whispers within his network, subtly eroding his credibility. Sophia's behavior also began to shift. She seemed more on edge, her usual confidence replaced by unease. I wasn't sure if it was guilt, or if she was starting to see Damian for who he really was. Either way, it didn't matter. The pieces were falling into place. The final step was setting the trap. A meeting was arranged, supposedly to finalize the deal, but in reality, it was the moment Damian's empire would come crashing down. As I prepared for that meeting, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Damian thought he had one. He thought he had taken everything from me. But by the time this was over, he'd realized just how wrong he was. The meeting was set. Damian's arrogance was his blind spot, and he had taken the bait so easily it was almost laughable. The fake investment deal had him hooked, and his desperation to secure it only exposed more of his true nature. I watched as the pieces of the plan began falling into place. Natalie was orchestrating every detail with the precision of a chess master, and Ryan kept me updated on Damian's movements. As much as I wanted to savor the thought of Damian's impending downfall, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't just against him. Sophia was still a question mark, and her silence unnerved me. That morning, as I sipped my coffee in the kitchen, Sophia walked in. She looked at me hesitantly, her gaze flickering between me and the cup in my hand. "Are you going somewhere today?" she asked, her tone cautious. I nodded, not offering any details. "Work meeting." She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she might say something meaningful, something that could bridge the growing chasm between us. But instead, she just nodded and turned away. "Is there something you want to talk about?" I asked, my voice calm but probing. She froze for a second before shaking her head. "No, nothing." I watched her retreat, a bitter taste settling in my mouth. Sophia's behavior was shifting, but whether it was guilt, regret, or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. I didn't have the time or energy to decipher her silence. My focus was on Damian. The meeting was set in a sleek, glass-walled office space downtown. It was the kind of place Damian thrived in, modern, impressive, and dripping with wealth. The stage was perfect for the man who loved appearances more than substance. I arrived early, settling into a corner of the conference room while Natalie and Ryan worked behind the scenes. The trap was carefully laid. Fake contracts, fabricated email exchanges, and even a planted investor to sell the illusion. Damian walked in 15 minutes later, exuding his usual overconfidence. He was dressed impeccably, his suit tailored to perfection, and his smile as smug as ever. Well, he said, spotting me. "James, I didn't expect to see you here. Trying to learn a thing or two about real business?" I kept my expression neutral, gesturing toward the seat across from me. "Just here to observe." Damian laughed, a low, condescending sound, and took his seat. "You might actually learn something for once." His arrogance was palpable, but I stayed calm, letting him believe he was in control. That's what people like Damian thrived on: dominance, the illusion of superiority. The meeting began, with the fake investor pitching the deal to Damian. I watched as Damian's eyes lit up, his greed on full display. He asked questions, feigned interest, and even attempted to negotiate better terms, all while trying to mask his desperation. Natalie had been right. Damian thrived on control, and the cracks in his confidence were starting to show. As the meeting progressed, I occasionally chimed in with innocuous comments, just enough to keep Damian slightly off balance. "You seem very eager, Damian," I said at one point, my tone casual. "Is everything okay on your end?" His smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Eager? No, just thorough. I like to know what I'm getting into." "Of course," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "It's important to be careful. You never know who you can trust these days." The tension in the room began to shift as the investor laid out the final terms of the deal. Damian's confidence wavered, his gaze darting between the documents and the investor's face. "This is a big commitment," Damian said, his tone hesitant for the first time. "Are you sure all the numbers check out?" The investor, a skilled actor Natalie had hired, smiled reassuringly. "Absolutely. Everything has been vetted thoroughly. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Damian hesitated, glancing at me as if searching for reassurance. I met his gaze, my expression unreadable. "Sounds like a great deal," I said evenly. "You'd be a fool to pass it up." That was all it took. Damian's ego couldn't resist the challenge. He signed the documents with a flourish, his smirk returning as he handed them back. "There," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Done. I guess this is what separates the winners from the losers, James." The room was silent for a moment before Natalie stepped in, her presence commanding. She held up a small device, her face calm but cold. "Congratulations, Damian," she said. "You just signed a legally binding agreement with nothing." His smirk vanished, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about?" Natalie placed the documents on the table, flipping through them as she spoke. "This deal doesn't exist. The company doesn't exist. The assets don't exist. But the fraud you just committed by falsifying these documents? That's very real." Damian's face turned pale, his composure crumbling. "This is some kind of joke," he stammered. "No joke," I said, finally standing. "This is the end of your little game." As the realization dawned on him, Damian's arrogance melted away, replaced by panic. The trap had snapped shut, and he had nowhere to run. I watched as he sputtered excuses, his once confident demeanor reduced to a pathetic scramble for control. The satisfaction I felt wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Damian had tried to destroy me, and now he was facing the consequences of his own greed and arrogance. This was only the beginning of his downfall, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally regaining control of my life. The day after the meeting with Damian, the house was unusually quiet. Even the ticking of the kitchen clock seemed to echo louder than usual. Sophia, Evelyn, had been distant lately, her usual sharpness dulled by something I couldn't yet place. It was hard to tell whether she was caught in the gravity of Damian's downfall or simply unraveling under the weight of her own decisions. I sat at the dining table, scrolling through updates from Natalie and Ryan. The fallout had already begun. The fake deal Damian had eagerly signed onto had been leaked to key players in his circle. Investors were pulling out, his credibility was crumbling, and whispers of criminal investigations were starting to surface. He was teetering on the edge of ruin, and the pieces were falling exactly where I needed them to. As I sipped my coffee, Evelyn walked into the room, her movements hesitant. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away, as though she were afraid of what she might see in my expression. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Morning," she replied quietly, sitting down across from me. She didn't touch the cup of tea she had made for herself. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Marcus, can we talk?" I set down my phone and leaned back in my chair. "I'm listening." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. I've been thinking. About everything. About Damian. About us." Her words hung in the air, and I could see the battle in her eyes, the struggle between pride and guilt, between defiance and remorse. "What about us?" I asked, keeping my tone calm but firm. She looked down at her hands. I think I made a mistake." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger or bitterness. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. What kind of mistake? I asked, my voice steady. Her lip trembled as she spoke. I thought Damian cared about me. I thought he understood me in a way you didn't anymore. But now I see that he was just using me. I studied her carefully, searching for sincerity in her words. And you didn't see that before? When he humiliated me in front of his friends? When he encouraged you to punch me, to laugh at me? She winced, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't have an excuse for that, Marcus. I let myself get caught up in something toxic, and I hurt you. I know that. And I don't know how to fix it. Her admission hit me harder than I expected. For weeks, I had been consumed by anger, by the need for revenge. Hearing her acknowledge her mistakes didn't erase the pain, but it cracked something open in me. You can't fix it, I said finally. Not overnight. Trust doesn't just come back because you say you're sorry. She nodded, wiping at her tears. I know, but I want to try. I want to make things right. And what about Damian? I asked, leaning forward. Where do you stand with him? Her face twisted in disgust. I'm done with him. After everything Natalie showed me, I can't believe I ever trusted him. He used me, Marcus, just like he used everyone else. That evening, Evelyn handed me her phone. It was a gesture that caught me off guard, an act of transparency I hadn't expected. Everything's in there, she said quietly. The messages, the calls, all of it. I want you to see what happened, so you'll understand. I took the phone and went through it carefully. The texts told a story of manipulation and deceit, of Damian playing on Evelyn's insecurities and feeding her just enough attention to keep her loyal. But as I read further, I saw the cracks in her resolve, the moments when she had started to question him. You doubted him, I said, looking up at her. She nodded. Toward the end, yes. But by then, I felt trapped. I didn't know how to get out. The next day, I met with Natalie to discuss the next phase of the plan. Evelyn's starting to see the truth, I told her. She handed me her phone. Let me see everything. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Do you believe her? I thought about it for a moment before nodding. I think she's genuine. She's not innocent, but I think she's starting to understand the damage she's caused. Good, Natalie said, because things are about to get messy. Damian's not going to go down quietly. That night, Evelyn approached me again, her expression softer, more vulnerable. Marcus, she said, her voice tentative. Do you think we can ever get back to where we were? I looked at her for a long moment, the weight of her question settling over me. I don't know, I said honestly, but if you're willing to do the work, maybe we can figure it out. Her shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. As I sat in my office later that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Evelyn's awakening was a step forward, but it wasn't the end. Damian was still out there, still scheming, and I knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. Evelyn might have been a pawn in Damian's game, but now she was ready to take back her power. And together, we were going to make sure Damian paid for every lie, every manipulation, and every ounce of pain he had caused. The stage was set. Damian was walking into the perfect storm, and he didn't even realize it. The false deal we had crafted was bait he couldn't resist, and now it was time to see how far he would go. Over the past few days, I had watched his arrogance grow. Damian believed he was in control, his overconfidence blinding him to the cracks Natalie had carefully orchestrated in his network. Investors were growing uneasy, his closest allies were turning on him, and yet he pressed forward, determined to secure the deal that would supposedly make him untouchable. What he didn't know was that every step he took deeper into this trap brought him closer to his downfall. Evelyn, meanwhile, had been a quiet presence in the house. Her remorse was evident, but she seemed unsure of how to approach me. I caught her watching me sometimes, as if trying to read my thoughts, but she never spoke about Damian unless I brought it up first. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest updates from Natalie, Evelyn walked into my office. She hesitated in the doorway before speaking. Marcus, she began, her voice uncertain. Can I ask you something? I looked up from my laptop, nodding. Go ahead. Do you think I was blind? She asked, her words trembling. Did I really not see what he was doing to me? I studied her for a moment, debating how honest to be. I think you wanted to believe what he told you, I said carefully. I think he gave you something you felt was missing, and you chose to overlook the warning signs because it was easier than facing the truth. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. I hate that I let him manipulate me. I hate that I hurt you because of it. I leaned back in my chair, sighing. The important thing is that you see it now, but that doesn't erase what's happened. Trust has to be rebuilt, Evelyn, and that takes time. Her eyes met mine, a flicker of determination in her expression. I'll do whatever it takes, she said softly. The day of the meeting arrived, and I could feel the tension building like a coiled spring. Natalie and Ryan were already at the venue, ensuring everything was in place. The office we had rented was pristine, modern, and designed to exude the kind of legitimacy Damian wouldn't question. When I arrived, Natalie was waiting for me in the conference room, her expression calm but focused. He's on his way, she said. Everything's set. Ryan entered a moment later, carrying a folder filled with the fake documents Damian would be reviewing. This guy's going to crash hard, he said with a grin. I almost feel sorry for him. Almost, I replied, a hint of a smile tugging at my lips. Damian arrived 10 minutes later, his usual swagger on full display. He strode into the room like he owned it, his tailored suit and confident smirk the same as always. Marcus, he said, extending his hand as if we were old friends. Good to see you again. I shook his hand, my grip firm but emotionless. Damian. He turned his attention to Natalie and Ryan, his eyes scanning them with calculated interest. And you must be the team behind this exciting opportunity. I have to say, I'm impressed with what I've seen so far. Natalie smiled politely, gesturing for him to take a seat. We're glad to hear that, Mr. Miles. Let's get started, shall we? The meeting began with Ryan presenting the fabricated details of the investment deal. Damian listened intently, nodding along and asking questions that revealed just how desperate he was to secure the opportunity. This is exactly what I've been looking for, Damian said, his enthusiasm barely contained. The timing couldn't be more perfect. I watched him carefully, noting the flicker of greed in his eyes as Ryan outlined the supposed returns. He was completely hooked, unable to see the trap closing around him. When it came time to review the contracts, Damian leaned forward eagerly, flipping through the pages with a practiced air of professionalism. He didn't notice the subtle inconsistencies Natalie had planted or the small details that would later expose him as complicit in fraud. This all looks good to me, he said, pulling a pen from his pocket. He signed the documents with a flourish, his smirk widening as he handed them back. There, he said, leaning back in his chair. Done. I have to say, Marcus, I wasn't expecting you to be part of something this impressive. Maybe there's hope for you yet. The room fell silent for a moment before Natalie spoke, her tone icy. Congratulations, Damian, she said. You just made the worst mistake of your life. His smirk faltered, confusion flashing across his face. What are you talking about? Natalie slid the contracts back toward him, her eyes cold. This deal doesn't exist. The company doesn't exist. But the fraudulent statements you just signed off on? Those are very real. Damian's face paled, his confidence crumbling. This is a joke, he said, his voice rising. You can't. I cut him off, standing and placing my hands on the table. No joke, Damian. This is what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. As the reality of the situation sank in, Damian's arrogance dissolved into panic. His bluster and bravado were gone, replaced by desperate attempts to regain control. You'll regret this, he spat, his voice shaking. You don't know who you're dealing with. I leaned in closer, my voice calm but firm. Neither did you. The trap had closed, and Damian was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The game was over, and I had won. Damian's downfall wasn't quiet, it was explosive. The moment he signed those fake contracts, he set off a chain reaction that not only dismantled his web of lies, but also exposed the rot at the core of his life. Watching it unfold was like standing in the eye of a storm, calm and in control while everything around me unraveled. The meeting had ended in chaos. Damian's smug confidence had shattered as Natalie revealed the truth. I could still see the disbelief in his eyes as she laid out how thoroughly we had trapped him. He left the room in a fury, vowing revenge, but deep down, we all knew he had already lost. The fallout started the next morning. Natalie and Ryan had leaked just enough information to key players in Damian's circle, investors, business associates, and even a few of his so-called friends. Whispers turned into murmurs, which quickly became public accusations. The first blow came from one of his investors, a man named Richard, who called a press conference to announce his grave disappointment in Damian and to distance himself from any association with him. Damian had siphoned money from Richard's projects for years, but now, with no room to maneuver, Richard turned on him. Soon after, others followed. Board members from Damian's company began resigning, citing a lack of trust in leadership. Financial backers pulled their support. Even his friends, the ones who had laughed at me during that infamous party, started whispering about Damian's unethical behavior. Evelyn watched it all unfold with a mixture of shock and shame. She sat in the living room, the news playing on the TV, as anchors dissected Damian's rise and fall. The smug grin he had worn so often was now replaced by images of him dodging reporters outside his office, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. She turned to me, her voice trembling. "Did you do this?" I didn't look away from the screen. "I didn't make Damian who he is," I said evenly. "I just exposed him for it." Her shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "I was so blind," she whispered. "How did I not see this coming?" I finally looked at her, my voice softer. "Because he's good at what he does. Manipulating people, making them believe in him, that's his skill. But his arrogance is what brought him down." She nodded, her tears streaming freely now. "I'm sorry, Marcus, for everything." While Evelyn wrestled with her guilt, Damian tried to fight back. He hired lawyers, issued statements claiming he was the victim of a smear campaign, and even attempted to shift the blame onto his former allies. But Natalie had anticipated his every move. She ensured that the evidence we had gathered, fake contracts, fraudulent financial statements, and even recordings of his manipulative conversations, made their way to the right authorities. The legal system moved quickly, and Damian soon found himself the subject of a full-scale investigation. The night the first warrant was issued for Damian's arrest, I sat in my office with Ryan, celebrating the victory. "You've done it," Ryan said, raising his glass of whiskey. "The guy's finished." I nodded, though my thoughts lingered on Evelyn. "He's finished," I agreed. "But this wasn't just about him." Ryan studied me for a moment before nodding. "Sophia's lucky you didn't just walk away." "Maybe," I said quietly, "but she has a long way to go if she wants to fix what she broke." The final blow to Damian came 2 days later. Authorities raided his office, seizing files, computers, and everything they could find. The media was relentless, capturing every humiliating moment as he was led out in handcuffs, his once perfect suit rumpled and his face pale. The same friends who had mocked me at that party were now avoiding Damian like the plague, their loyalty as shallow as their laughter had been loud. But the real satisfaction came that evening, when I received a call from Natalie. "Damian's trying to cut a deal," she said, her tone laced with amusement. "He's offering to give up information on his investors in exchange for leniency." "Let him," I said. "By the time he's done, no one will trust him again." Evelyn and I watched the news that night, sitting in silence as the anchor detailed Damian's fall from grace. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think I can ever make this right?" she asked softly. I looked at her, my voice steady. "That's not a question I can answer, Evelyn. It's something you'll have to prove, day by day." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I will. I promise." As I stood in the doorway of my office later that night, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Damian's pride had been his greatest weapon, but it had also been his greatest weakness. By the time the dust settled, he would have nothing left. Not his reputation, not his wealth, and certainly not the people who had once worshipped him. Evelyn's journey to redemption was just beginning, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But for now, I felt a sense of closure. Damian had tried to destroy me, but in the end, He had only destroyed himself. And that was a victory I would savor for a long time. The days after Damian's arrest were quieter than I anticipated. The media frenzy around his downfall continued, with new revelations surfacing daily about his fraudulent schemes and manipulations. Yet, within the walls of my home, the silence between Evelyn and me felt heavier than any headline. She was trying, I could see that. Every day, she made small attempts to bridge the chasm between us, bringing me coffee, asking about my day, tidying up the house. But it wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. Trust couldn't be rebuilt with gestures alone. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing emails, Evelyn knocked on the door. Her voice was hesitant. "Marcus, can I come in?" I glanced up, nodding. "Sure." She stepped inside, clutching a notebook to her chest. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I set my laptop aside, giving her my full attention. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then sat down across from me, placing the notebook on the desk. "I've been writing everything down," she said quietly. "Everything I've been feeling, everything I've done. I thought it might help me understand how I let things get so bad." I stared at the notebook, unsure how to respond. "Why show this to me?" "Because I need you to see that I'm trying," she said, her voice cracking. "I need you to know that I'm not proud of what I did, that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." I opened the notebook, flipping through the pages. Her handwriting was messy, the words spilling out like a confession. She wrote about how she had felt neglected in our marriage, how Damian's attention had made her feel seen, valued. But she also wrote about the guilt, the shame, the moments when she doubted him but ignored her instincts. "You felt neglected," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But instead of talking to me, you turned to someone else. Someone who used you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I should have come to you, Marcus. I should have trusted you instead of him. But I didn't, and I hate myself for it." Her vulnerability was raw, unfiltered, and for the first time, I saw the depth of her remorse. "Do you understand what Damian really was?" I asked, leaning forward. "He didn't care about you, Evelyn. You were a tool to him, a way to hurt me and gain access to what I've built." She nodded, her hands shaking. "I see that now. He made me feel like I mattered, but it was all a lie. And I let myself believe it because I was too afraid to face the truth. Which is," I pressed, "that I was the problem," she admitted. "That I let my insecurities and my pride blind me to what we had. And I ruined it." I leaned back in my chair, processing her words. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give freely, not after everything that had happened. But I could see that she was trying, genuinely trying, to take responsibility for her actions. "What do you want from me, Evelyn?" I asked, my tone softening. "I want a chance to fix this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it'll take time. I know I've lost your trust. But I want to prove to you that I can be better. That we can be better." That night, I sat alone in the living room, the notebook still in my hands. Her words echoed in my mind, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward understanding. Damian's fall had exposed more than just his lies. It had forced both Evelyn and me to confront the fractures in our relationship. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like there was a possibility of rebuilding. But rebuilding didn't mean forgetting. And it didn't mean letting go of the lessons I had learned. Evelyn had to earn her place back in my life, piece by piece, day by day. As I placed the notebook on the table, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. I was fighting for clarity, for closure, and maybe, just maybe, for a second chance. Because while Damian was gone, his shadow still lingered. And it was up to Evelyn and me to decide whether we could step out of it together, or if we would walk away for good. The day after Damian's sentencing felt surreal. It was official. 10 years in prison, with additional fines and asset forfeitures. The man who once sat in my home, drinking my whiskey and mocking me in front of my wife, had been reduced to a footnote in his own story, a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. The headlines painted him as a villain, the media dissecting every move he made, every life he had destroyed. But I wasn't focused on him anymore. Damian was no longer the center of my attention. That chapter of my life was over. Now, it was about rebuilding what he tried to destroy. Evelyn was in the kitchen when I walked in that morning, nervously making coffee. She glanced up when she saw me, her expression cautious. "I saw the news," she said quietly. "It's over, isn't it?" "For him, yes," I replied, pouring myself a cup. "But for us? That depends." She nodded, her eyes dropping to the counter. "I know I can't expect things to go back to the way they were. And I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I'm willing to keep trying, Marcus. If you'll let me." Her words carried weight, but they weren't enough. Not yet. "Evelyn, rebuilding this, it's not going to happen overnight. And it's not going to happen unless you're willing to face the hard truths about what you've done and why." "I am," she said firmly, meeting my gaze. "I've started therapy. I've been journaling, reflecting, and trying to understand how I let things get this far. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to show you that I can change." Her determination was genuine, and while a part of me still held onto the anger and betrayal, another part felt the faint stirrings of hope. That afternoon, I met Ryan and Natalie for coffee to close the chapter on Damian's case. They had been instrumental in bringing him down, and I owed them more than I could ever repay. Natalie smirked as she sipped her latte. "Well, I have to say, that was one of the most satisfying takedowns I've been a part of. Damian never saw it coming." Ryan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "The guy was a textbook narcissist. He thought he was invincible. Watching him fall apart was therapeutic." I nodded, though my thoughts were elsewhere. "Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done this without you." "Just make sure you don't let anyone like him get close again," Natalie said, her tone teasing but serious. "Trust me," I replied. "I've learned my lesson." When I returned home, Evelyn was waiting for me in the living room. She had set out 2 glasses of wine, her expression nervous but hopeful. "Can we talk?" she asked. I sat down across from her, taking a sip of the wine. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about us," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to earn back your trust. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I studied her for a moment, considering her words. "Evelyn, trust isn't something you can earn overnight. It's built piece by piece, through actions, not words." "I understand," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "and I'm ready to do the work." The days that followed were a cautious dance between rebuilding and reflection. Evelyn kept her word, attending therapy, journaling, and making genuine efforts to address the fractures in our relationship. I, too, spent time reflecting, not just on her betrayal but on the ways I might have contributed to the distance between us. It wasn't about blaming myself for her choices, but about understanding how we had reached such a breaking point. One evening, as we sat together on the patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Evelyn turned to me and said, "Do you think we can ever truly move past this?" I considered her question carefully before replying. "I think we can try, but it'll take time, patience, and honesty. If we're willing to put in the effort, maybe we can find something stronger on the other side." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of guilt or regret. They were tears of hope. As I watched her that night, I realized something important. Damian had tried to destroy me, to take everything I valued and turn it into ashes. But in the process, he had forced me to confront the cracks in my life and rebuild it with intention. I didn't know what the future held for Evelyn and me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving forward together. And that, more than anything, was the victory I truly needed.